Good morning. If you're just getting on, feel free to leave a comment and tell us where you're from. Hope you are all having a happy Monday so far. Thanks for getting on. All right, I think I've got this set up. All right, welcome. Hello from Columbus. Hi, Liz. South Jersey. Very cool. Thanks for getting on. Tell us where you're from as you get on. We've got piano teachers from all over the place, right? I'm excited to do another Periscope today. I feel like I'm starting to get the hang of this a little bit. I have to say it's a little bit daunting to know that I'm talking to people but not being able to see them. It's interesting. Hello to Susan from San Antonio. It's good to see you, Susan. San Diego. Very cool. All right, so this is the fourth Periscope broadcast that I'm trying out. I guess we can dive right in and get started. So my name is Joy Morin. If you don't know me, I am a piano teacher in Ohio and a blogger at colorinmypiano.com, which is a pretty fun place, I think, to talk about effective and engaging piano teaching. So this is a new series that I'm experimenting with for my blog, where we spend time, talking about a certain topic each week. And it could be a topic that I come up with that I want to talk about with you guys, or it could be a topic that you guys suggest. Today comes from a suggestion, so I want to talk a little bit about time management during the piano lesson. So how do we spend the time with students, especially since the time is oftentimes so limited. So let me read to you the question that was sent to me by a reader of my blog. So this question today comes from Sony from New Jersey. So her question was, time management. How do I fit everything I want to cover in a half-hour lesson, especially with beginners who still need a lot of instruction? In addition to reviewing the previous week's material, there's sight reading, theory, extra review of concepts a student might be struggling with, there's improvisation, there's composition, not to mention that younger students often need a break away from the bench with games, manipulatives, flashcards, etc. Obviously, I can't fit it all into the piano lesson without rushing through everything, so how do I manage my time effectively during a lesson? So thank you to Sony for this very good question. I bet you can all relate to this. I definitely can relate to this question. Give me some hearts by tapping on your screen if you can relate to this issue of trying to fit in so many things into the piano lesson. It's a challenge, and I think there's a lot of directions that we could potentially go with answering this question and sharing our ideas about this. And I suppose the most obvious thing to talk about would be, if you are teaching half-hour lessons, we could talk about bumping up students who need more time up to 45-minute lessons, or maybe even an hour. But I think still that's a valid question, no matter how much time you have that you're spending with students, there's still this issue of not enough time. That feeling is always there. And I think there's a lot of times where 30 minutes is long enough, especially if you have young 5-year-old students who can't sit still for long periods of time. So increasing the lesson time is still not necessarily always the solution. There's other things to think about and talk about. So despite that there's other directions we could go, there's just one thing I want to talk about today in connection with this. And this is a perspective that I gained at a conference I went to this summer. So I have to give credit where it's due. So I'll talk about that. But I think this perspective is one that's very helpful, regardless of the level of the student, regardless of how much time you have in the lesson with a student. It's, I hope, something that's will be as useful to you as it is to me. So let me restate the problem a little bit and elaborate on it a little bit. So the problem is time management, feeling like we have enough time to cover everything that we want to cover with students. And although this wasn't necessarily stated this way in Sony's question that she sent me, I think the underlying thing that we all feel as piano teachers, it's our responsibility to create musicians that are really well-rounded in our students and making sure that we're covering all of these different areas. So maybe you guys can chime in with some comments at this point. If you had to think about some of the components of music, music education, We want to make sure our students can sight read well. We want to make sure that we cover theory with them. What else? Can you type in some of those elements of music? Sight reading, theory, there's ear training. Liz says transposition, that's a great one. There's kind of the creative side too. We could talk about composing and improvising. We could talk about, I guess as far as theory goes, to me there's kind of two sides. There's where you're analyzing the music and understanding the music, but also being able to kind of create with it and understanding chords and working with chords. So there's all of these different areas, to music. Liz says playing by ear, that's a great one. We could talk about performing as kind of an aspect as well. We could talk about memorizing. So there's all these elements that we want to make sure that we are covering and that our students, we're producing good students who have all of these important skills as musicians. But it just doesn't feel like there's enough time to do this. We want to make sure we're doing a good job, but it just doesn't seem possible to cover all of these elements in every single piano lesson with students. So what do? Do we kind of rotate through these different skills and make sure that they're all covered? That's one possible way to think about it. But I want to talk about this perspective shift that I got from the conference I went to this summer. So the conference, if you're not familiar with it, it's called the National Conference on Keyboard Pedagogy. So it's referred to as NCKP for short. This is a conference that is held every other year. It's always in the summer, usually the end of July, and it's held at a conference hotel in the greater Chicago area. So it's Lombard, Illinois. It's a really great conference to go to. If you've never gone to a national level conference such as this, I would highly recommend it. If you want to check it out, their website is keyboardpedagogy.org. This conference is held by, it's sponsored by a nonprofit called the Francis Clark Center for Keyboard Pedagogy. So anyway, this was the conference I went to this last summer, and on Wednesday of the conference, they have a pre-conference seminar day. It's kind of an optional extra day to kick off the conference, and then the actual conference starts Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So I went to a track on Wednesday that was for the independent music teacher, and one of the first speakers for that pre-conference seminar was Pete Jutras. Some of you might recognize his name. He's the editor for the Clavier Companion magazine, which is a great magazine. And he gave a talk that was called, "What Are We Really Teaching?" Basically, if I had to summarize his talk into a nutshell, he talked about this idea of a holistic approach to piano teaching, where all those different elements that we talked about, the ear training, the rhythm, the sight reading, the theory, all those types of things, it's all approached and taught through the repertoire that we're teaching students. They're already learning this repertoire, and we try to hit on all these different areas through the repertoire instead of necessarily approaching them through separate books or separate activities. So he had this whole idea of not losing sight of the wholeness of music. I want to get more into that in a second, but it was really neat because throughout the day of this conference, the other speakers in the same track all hit on the same idea. It was neat to see this common thread kind of running through the day. So later in the day, there was a talk given by Elisa Milne, who is an Australian teacher and composer, and she really picked up on this thread a lot in her talk. Her session was called Repertoire Recipes. So in her talk, she presented this idea of looking at a piece of music in terms of its ingredients. So if we're thinking of a recipe, so this was her analogy that any piece of music has ingredients to it that we can examine and try to understand, and we can also play around with. So we could tweak the recipe a little bit. We could play around with some of the ingredients and really be able to cook with music because we understand how the ingredients work together. So she led us through a bunch of examples of common teaching pieces that I'm sure many of us have taught our students. She talked about what those ingredients are in a particular piece of music, and then she interacted with the audience a lot to figure out how those ingredients could be tweaked and how being creative with those elements, changing them, tweaking them, actually helps us understand the piece itself and how it's supposed to be performed more. And it also allows us to express more. And so anyway, that was a really great talk, and that was really helpful to think of music in terms of that. Just as an example, like an ingredient might be, I think one of the pieces she talked about was that this piece called Bagpipe, which is kind of an anonymous composer piece, which is commonly put in a lot of classical anthologies. If you guys have heard of this piece, tap on the screen and give me some hearts. But I'm sure some of you know this. I think it goes, if I remember right. Okay, good. Some of you recognize this. Great. So that was one of the pieces that she talked about, and she talked about the elements like of that fifth that you heard in the left hand. How could we change that fifth? I'm sure some of you guys could have some ideas. You can type some of those in. But some of the ideas that we talked about that day were moving the fifth around more, or adding the grace note to it so it has more of the bagpipe sound, or breaking the fifth, or inverting the fifth, or whatever you might come up with. She talked about changing the form of the piece, so instead of having ternary ABA form, what if it were just AV form, or things like that. So it's all about experimenting with the music with the students so that they can explore what the sound possibilities are. So to get back to our topic a little bit here, to kind of summarize this, so it's this idea of thinking in terms of there being there is this breakdown, I think, in music education that we do want to recognize these separate skills. Sight reading, dealing with rhythm, understanding the music, so theory, ear training, that sort of thing. But at the same time, the music is all working together still. Like when we make music, we're doing multiple things. We're involving all of those different elements. And if we try to separate and fragment things too much, then there's some disadvantages. For one thing, the time management thing that we talked about, but I think also it forces us to do a lot of work as far as, it's almost like, if we deal with rhythm completely separately from repertoire and the pieces that students are learning, it's almost like you have to create your own curriculum just for rhythm, which is really challenging and time consuming, and it makes so much more sense to be approaching rhythm in terms of what the students are playing. So that sort of thing, I think. And creating music is really all about, like I said, thinking in multiple levels at once. So it just makes so much sense to teach the skills in combination with each other in that way. So I really liked that perspective that I gained at NCKP about trying to think more holistically and keeping the big picture in mind, as well as those smaller things too. So let's talk about applying this a little bit. I want to give a few examples, and I would love to hear any thoughts that you guys might have, so please chime in anytime with your thoughts and ideas. But so if we are in our lessons trying to use this approach and thinking more holistically, I guess I'll mention one mistake that we could do is have all separate books for these separate things. So we might think that we need to have a dedicated sight reading book for every student. We might think that we need to have a dedicated rhythm book. We might think that we need a separate theory book. We might think that we need a separate ear training book, and on it goes. But in reality, just because I don't have a book that's called sight reading, that doesn't mean that I'm not producing students who can sight read well, right? We've talked about this actually before, that if you want to have students be able to sight read well, then you want to give them many opportunities to sight read well. But it doesn't have to be a book that says sight reading on the cover. It could be lots of sight reading during lesson time. It could be duet playing. It could be, providing lots of short-term project pieces like we talked about in the last broadcast, so that they are sight reading often, just naturally, without necessarily having a book that's labeled such. So in some ways, sometimes I think that a lot of the mainstream piano methods today kind of work against us. Do you guys feel that way? I guess because a lot of the mainstream piano methods available today have a separate book for technique. And that just kind of makes me scratch my head sometimes, because technique should be taught through anytime the student is playing at the piano. And I think technique books can be helpful, definitely. But I don't know, that just kind of makes me scratch my head sometimes. I don't know if that resonates with you. The method books today have, they might have the main, thanks Elizabeth for joining us. She's got to go, she says. The main book might be like the lesson book, and then there might be a performance book, and then there's the theory book, and then a technique book. There might be a hymn book, there's a sight reading book, and so on. There's so many books available at every level in a typical mainstream piano method today. Sometimes I find it really overwhelming, and usually I pick and choose. I don't know about you. Maybe it works better for you to do all of the books, but for me it works better to pick and choose. We have a comment here. This teacher says, send a student home with a learn your own piece for sight reading. I think that's a great suggestion. That's a really great way to have the student be focusing on sight reading at home. And it's not necessarily, a dedicated book, although it could be, but it could be covered more at home, so that can help with time management for sure. Thank you for that. So I like to choose a couple of core books from the piano method, and then I like to be able to supplement with things that are different from the piano method, and that helps me a lot. And sometimes I find it refreshing to experiment with other methods, like Piano Safari is a good example of a less mainstream method that's being self-published, and it's pretty much all in one. Everything that you need is in the one book, and I find that really refreshing sometimes. Another one that I've been experimenting with recently is Tales of a Musical Journey, which is a self-published piano method by Irina Gorin. I've been really impressed with that piano method, which I won't get into that right now, but I absolutely love that everything is in the one book. It's really refreshing. So maybe we don't need to do like all 8 books at every level with a student. We can think about how we can combine and be more holistic about our teaching, but still be very thorough at the same time. So if we do want to think in terms of these elements separately, for example, if we have a student who does really have a weakness in sight reading and they need extra focus on sight reading, then certainly that's when I would buy a separate sight reading book that can really help us target and focus on that. But I don't think it should be our default that we have to feel like it's a separate element that has to be covered in a special separate way. So let's give an example, because I want to be specific. So let's suppose that we have a student who is struggling with rhythm in general. So what could we do to help the student with rhythm without necessarily, buying a book, or without, partitioning off a dedicated 5 minutes of the lesson towards rhythm? What could we do instead to make it more natural and holistic and incorporated? So what we could do is every time we introduce a new piece to a student, you could do some rhythm clapbacks using each measure of rhythm in the new piece. So, the teacher, that means, you're tapping a rhythm, and the student is tapping it right back to you. And this might not even be looking at the music. I mean, you could look at the piece and pick different measures and tap it together, but the student might be doing it mostly aurally. So here's again where we're combining elements. We're not just working on rhythm, we're working on ear training at the same time, which is really awesome. Or if you wanted it to be more integrating the music, so it's more of reading the rhythms versus as much ear work, then you could kind of do a game where the teacher is tapping a rhythm and the student is looking for it in the piece and pointing to the measure where it is. And that requires a little bit more reading then too, and it connects those 3 elements together: the rhythm work, the aural work, and then the visual. So you can be creative. It's helpful to think in terms of these separate elements if you're also thinking holistically, isn't it? Which is really interesting. So that's one example, I think, of how we can kind of combine these different elements and think about them in a useful way, but still think holistically. So I want to kind of wrap it up here for today, but there's one last thing I wanted to talk about that Sony brought up in her original question, because she talked about younger students needing a break away from the bench with games, manipulatives, flashcards, etc. So that is, again, that's it's this problem where I guess what I want to say is we sometimes ask the wrong question, and that causes us sometimes to arrive at the wrong answers. So if we ask the question in a way, I need to have a game every lesson with a student, what would that be? That's not really the right question to be asking. It's easy to think that way, and I think that way sometimes too, but we want to be thinking more about the teaching and the content and the pedagogy, I think. So the question would be, what does the student need to learn, and what's the best way to do it? And in my opinion, there's some games that I depend on. There's a certain set of games that I use a lot. Especially when students get to certain stages, I'll use, a certain game. I depend on that game because I think it's the best way to work on X. So if you ask the question more in terms of that and be really focused on content, then I think that solves that problem for us too. And that helps solve that time management issue, if that makes sense. So let me give one example. So this is with a beginner student who's first, getting introduced to the keyboard and learning the letter names of the keys. So one of the first things, as we're starting to get familiar with the names of the piano keys, the letter names, we do a game or kind of a little drill where we're looking for all the D's on the piano, and then we're looking for all the F's on the piano. And I make that into an assignment that the student is practicing that, at home as like a warm-up game exercise. And then there's this keyboard race game that I like to do with students as well, and we do this for a number of weeks, kind of alternating between these games because it's the best way to learn the names of the piano keys. Worksheets might help too, but I think it's the closest to actually doing it. When you actually play a piece of music, you need to be able to find the piano key you need, so you need to be familiar with them. So this puts the student on the spot and figures them out, and it's largely a mental activity, and it's physical too. So I like that. So the keyboard race game is basically where you have some way to randomly choose a letter of the alphabet. So sometimes I use a bag of Scrabble tiles. And of course, I've removed all the letters except for A through G for the music alphabet. So we randomly choose a letter from that bag, and we each have a game token of some kind. So you can use anything that you want, but those Japanese puzzle erasers that look like animals are really fun. I think I have one right here. So here's one. This is a little koala. I'm sure many of you have these. You can tap me some hearts if you have some of these little guys, but they fit so well on the piano keyboard. So let's say that I start with this. Lots of you have these, it looks like. We start with our game tokens on one end of the keyboard, on the low end, let's say, and then if I choose the letter C from the bag, then I need to move my game pawn to the next C on the keyboard, and then the other person takes a turn, and maybe they draw an F, so they get to jump all the way to the next F. And so on. The gameplay keeps going until we make it sometimes to make it shorter, I'll just say that we're racing to middle C, or sometimes we'll do the entire keyboard. And whoever gets to the end first wins the race. It's just kind of fun that way. It's just a way to practice the letter names. So there's games like that. It's all about the content though. We have to ask ourselves, we're not just playing a game to play a game, but we're looking at what those skills are, what is it that we want to target, what do we want to practice, and how does that help the big picture, right? How does that help our students when they're learning repertoire? So I want to hear some of your ideas. Do you guys have favorite games that you think work really well to target certain skills? Or have you thought about this idea of thinking holistically in your teaching, or do you have ideas for doing that? I guess the main point, if I had to summarize today, please type your comments in now if you have those. But to summarize, I just want to say that we need to be very careful and deliberate about being aware of the big picture when we teach, as well as the small elements. And it's the interplay between that really makes us be effective teachers. So time management is something during the lesson that I definitely struggle with too, but I just definitely wanted to have a conversation about this because I think this perspective that I got at NCKP was very helpful to me. So that's what I have for today. Thanks for watching. I guess I'll wrap it up for today. If you guys think of comments and suggestions and you have game ideas that you want to share or whatever else, you can leave those comments at my blog, colorinmypiano.com. This video will be available there very soon. And I'll just wrap up and say that if you guys are enjoying this series, please let me know. I appreciate the feedback. I appreciate suggestions that you might have. If you have ideas for topics for future broadcasts, you can visit my blog and submit those. The page you want to go to is colorinmypiano.com/live. And there's a link at the bottom there where you can click through and submit some ideas. Liz says, yes, I love the series. Thank you so much, Liz. That means a lot. So thank you again for watching. I'd love to hear from you guys. Share your ideas, please, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great teaching week. Bye, everyone.